In this lecture, you'll make the figure you've drawn more naturalistic. Then we'll discuss the skeletal system and the major muscles. At the end of the last lecture, I'd suggested printing copies of your drawings. We'll use them now. At the very beginning of the course, we discussed the interplay of cross-contour and contour. We saw how their skillful integration could create volume, like in the Holbein. Using the copies, I'd like you to experiment with different ways of moving from contour to cross-contour and then compare the results. Start with line alone. Make as much use of the measure, contours, and cross-contours you've carefully created to bring out a more naturalistic, less mannequin-like figure. You'll find that you have to change very little to make this happen. A slight rounding of a line does a lot in this regard. And if you'd like, try some value, hatching or other mark making. Follow the planar structure. You'll find, like Cambiaso, that having this structure makes imagining the play of light a straightforward matter. You could also try other variations. For instance, if your figure's male, try a female, or vice versa. Then play with relative proportions. You can make the shoulders smaller or the pelvis bigger, or change the positions of the arms, legs, or head and neck. Once you've made some experiments, naturalize the figure in your original drawing. Use the line alone, don't add any hatching or value, and leave the arms and legs as they are. That's because we'll be adding bone and muscle to our three views. You're likely aware that artists like Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Rubens, and many others studied human anatomy. Many artists do so to this day. A knowledge of what's going on below the surface can really help you draw what's visible on the surface. We'll start with the skeletal system. The goal is to draw the skeleton into your three views. Let's take a look at a couple examples. Here, a female. Here, using the same basic proportions, a male. In both cases, we still have the underlying sense of shape and volume, and the internal skeletal structure has been related to the proportions of the existing figure. There are over 200 bones in our bodies. Different texts quote different numbers. Some interpret a section as a single bone, while others define the same section as two or more bones. The number of bones in the body also changes over our lives. We have more separate bones at birth. For instance, the bones of the sacrum and those of the coccyx don't fully fuse until adolescence. And there's also some variation from individual to individual. For instance, a small percentage of individuals, under 1%, may have an extra cervical rib. While there are over 200 bones in the body, many repeat right and left, and about half are in our hands and feet, so that cuts down what we need to study to understand the large masses of the body. Let's take a tour from top to bottom. We'll start with the skull or cranium. Many people think of this area as being the face. The skull reminds us that the features occupy a fraction of the multiplanar terrain of the head. The skull has a front plane, right and left side planes, a top plane, a rear plane, and a split level underside. The bottom of the back of the skull is higher up than the underplane of the chin. In drawing, it's crucial to pay attention to this structure. The large frontal bone of the forehead in relation to the temporal foci on either side signals the change of plane from front to side. The zygomatic bone or cheekbone reiterates this. All the joints in the skull are rigid with the exception of the mandible or jaw, which can move both up and down and from side to side. Attached to the base of the skull, we find the spinal or vertebral column. It's the longest section of bone in the body, consisting of the upper 24 vertebrae. These are similarly shaped and separated by intravertebral discs, then the sacrum and coccyx. The upper 24 vertebrae are divided into three sections, each curving in a different direction, lending the spine its snake-like undulations. The top 7 vertebrae are termed cervical, here meaning neck. So part 1 is the neck section of the spine. That 7th vertebra is often a visible landmark in both the posterior and lateral views. The neck section, consisting of 12 vertebrae, is termed thoracic, meaning the general area containing the clavicles, sternum, rib cage, and the scapulae, what we've been referring to as the upper torso. The third section consists of 5 vertebrae. These are termed lumbar, referring to the section of the body below the ribs and extending to the pelvis. These 3 vertebral sections are followed by the sacrum attaching to the pelvis and the smaller coccyx projecting to a point. The assembly of the sacrum and coccyx curves once again away from the direction preceding section, the lumbar vertebrae. Depending on an individual's build and body fat, we may see traces of the vertebrae in a rear or partial rear view. The sacrum can also be a visible landmark through the soft tissue. The curving shape of the spine is easily visible in the lateral view. It accounts in part for the zigzagging spatial thrusts of the neck, rib cage, and pelvis, respectively. Many people forget that these same planar shifts are occurring when we view the figure in the anterior and posterior positions. So it's a good idea to keep this in mind when drawing these views. The next bone mass is referred to as the shoulder girdle. The main bones concerned are the clavicles, scapulae, and the sternum or breastbone. It's an assembly where skeletal elements of front and rear connect, and it provides the housing where the head of the humerus, the bone of the upper arm, will connect. Feel out along your collarbone from the center of your body. You start at a dip, that's the jugular notch at the top of the sternum, then a slight rise onto the collarbone, then perhaps a slight curving dip, and you're also moving back in space. Then, as you've almost reached your arm, a slight drop-off. Here, you're no longer on the collarbone, but on the top plane of the scapula, the acromion. The collarbone's often among the most visible on the surface of the body. Many people draw it extending a bit too far so that it covers a humerus. It shouldn't. It's actually the complex scapula that we see here. Neither the clavicles nor scapulae are fixed. We can move a shoulder forward or back because this assembly moves together, with the scapula gliding across the rounded back of the rib cage. The scapula, too, is often visible through the flesh in many views. While basically triangular in shape, its planar structure is complex. Studying the scapula and its connection to the clavicle and humerus from multiple points of view will really help you understand how the arms connect to the torso. The sternum's tie-shaped, with a hexagonal shorter top section called the manubrium and a dagger-like longer bottom. It's referred to as the body of the sternum. It ends in a short pointed section called the xiphoid process. The sternum's at the front and center of the rib cage. There are 24 ribs, 12 on each side, all attached to the sternum via cartilage and directly to the spinal column in the rear. The first 5 pairs of ribs attach singly and directly to the sternum, though the top pair is the only one that attaches to the manubrium. It's partially overlapped by the clavicles in the front, and in the rear attaches to the 7th cervical vertebra. The next 4 pairs attach to the longer body of the sternum. The following 2 pairs, 6 and 7, attach to the angled edge of the sternum. They're also interconnected by web-like cartilage. That cartilage splays like antlers, allowing pairs 8, 9, and 10 to attach through this web. The 11th and 12th pairs don't connect in the front and are referred to as floating ribs. 11 is longer, 12 the shortest. The full ribs curve around the body from back to front, sloping diagonally down as they curve. Like the skull to the head, the rib cage defines the 3-dimensional structure of the upper torso. It's a classic mix of anatomical rectilinearity and curvilinearity. We can think of it like a block or spheroid. Either way, we want to feel the front plane, side planes, and back plane. The ribs can serve as cross contours, making volume in this part of the figure palpable. A slight indication of the final full rib, number 10, can often help in this regard. As long as we're in the region, I note that beginning students often misplace the nipples on both men and women. It's essential to remember that the front plane of the body isn't flat. Let's look at Dürer's cross-sections, at the chest level in particular. Just as a rib cage has a degree of curvature to it, the muscle and soft tissue follow the curve of the armature. It gets a bit cut off, so I've recreated it. You can see that the right side of the chest faces to the right, the left to the left. The nipples and women's breasts will tend to follow, angling out. Along with the rib cage, the pelvis is another crucial structure to remember when drawing the figure. It's the second largest bone mass. Again, we want to remember it's 3D, bow-like, or like an upside-down helmet of sorts. We'll often see the top edge of the pelvis, the iliac crest. This coincides with the top of the miniskirt shape we drew. Traces of the iliac spine may also be visible. The wide bottom part of the miniskirt shape is defined by the top portion of the femur, the great trochanter. In both the arms and legs, the section of the limbs closest to the trunk has one bone, the neck section two, and the feet and hands come in at over 25 each. In the arm, the large upper bones, the humerus. The two smaller bones of the lower arm are the ulna and radius. Both have a wider and a narrower end. The ulna is wide at the connection with the humerus and narrow at the wrist. The radius, the opposite. We'll often see evidence of both at the wrist. In our anterior view, the ulna will be on the inside, the radius on the outside. In the posterior, the opposite. The large upper bone of the leg is the femur. If you stand up straight with your toes together, the femur angles in. On the front of the femur at the knee is the patella. This is another often visible landmark. In the lower leg, we find the larger tibia and the much thinner fibula. The former sits directly below, really centered on the femur. The fibula attaches to the outside and a bit below the top of the tibia. It also extends past the end of the tibia. The bottom of these bones produce the landmarks of the ankle. Since the fibula goes down lower, the outside of the ankle appears lower than the inside. Inside high, outside low. As already noted, both hands and feet are bone-rich. Thankfully, they group into three main sections. I'll go over them briefly. I don't require my students to draw them. It's difficult at the scale we're drawing at here. In the hand, the first section consists of 8 carpal bones. The next, the 5 metacarpals in the palm, then the phalanges in the fingers, with 2 joints in the thumb and 3 in the other fingers. The structure is more or less repeated in the foot. Start out with 7 tarsals instead of 8 carpals, then metatarsals and phalanges or toes. At the heel end, the bone of the heel is a calcaneus. Let's take a look at comparative lengths of the major bones and bone groups we've discussed. Having a mental picture of this helps when thinking about proportion. Using the skull's height as a metric, we find that the clavicle, scapula, sternum, sacrum, and hand are somewhat smaller. The ulna, radius, pelvis, and foot a bit longer. Next in size are the humerus, rib cage, fibula, tibia, and femur, all between 1 and 2 skull heights, and the spine at close to 3. Not all the bones are equally visible on the surface. Let's review the major landmarks. They include the frontal bone of the forehead, the temporal foci, the zygomatic bone, the 7th cervical vertebra, the jugular notch and sternum, the front and top of both clavicles, the scapulae, the bottom of the 10th rib, and in the arm, the elbow, the meeting of the humerus, radius, and ulna. And at the wrist, the ulna on the pinky side and the radius, thumb side. In the pelvis, the iliac spine and the anterior superior iliac crest. And in the rear, traces of the sacrum. Moving into the leg, the great trochanter of the femur. At the knee, front and center, the patella. On the outside, both the bottom of the femur and the top of the fibula. On the inside, the top of the tibia. In the mid-lower leg, the front of the tibia, the shin bone. And the bottom of the tibia and fibula, the ankles. Next time you're drawing a figure, look for these landmarks. If you're drawing from your imagination, you may want to reference them. To help you see how the skeleton relates to the exterior shapes you've drawn, I'd like you to draw a skeleton into each of your figures. An image search will turn up many excellent illustrations online, both of the entire skeleton in different views, as well as individual bones and close-ups of specific sections. Investing in a study skeleton can be a real aid. While life size is ideal, there are many smaller models that help give a sense of how the parts relate three-dimensionally. While the number of bones gets pegged in the 200s, the muscles are much more numerous. There are two main types of muscles, voluntary and involuntary. The voluntary muscles are attached to the skeletal structure. They're the ones we consciously move. In drawing, these are the ones we're interested in. As with bones, people disagree about what constitutes a single muscle, so the numbers you see vary from the 600s into the 800s. Many sources quote a number around 650. The good news is that our interest in muscles is pretty much aligned with bodybuilders. We're primarily concerned with muscles that can be seen on the surface. That chips away at the number, and because we're bilaterally symmetrical, many get counted twice. That knocks it down too. But that still leaves a lot of material to cover. This lecture will constitute an introduction. The goal here, once you've drawn the skeleton into your three views, is to draw the muscles we'll discuss into half of your anterior and posterior views and fully into the lateral view. You can use graphite pencils for this project, or you could use color. When I do this project with my undergrads at the University of Washington, we use erasable colored pencils. I found that Color Erase brand works well. If you'd like to try this, I'd suggest getting 8 pencils: yellow, orange, red, blue, brown, gray, black, and white. Imagine the light coming from a single direction. Where the muscle swells towards the light, make it lighter. Where the muscles taper, where they are overlapped and away from the light, go darker and into the darker browns, blues, and blacks. We'll look at the 13 most prominent muscles of the torso in some detail. For most, we'll consider their shape, where they attach to the bone, and their function. Then we'll chart the major muscles of the legs and arms. That will bring us to about 55 muscles, a good start. While bones have fixed shapes, muscles don't. They change shape as they relax or contract, and that adds a level of complexity. When bodybuilders compete, they flex and pose in positions to maximize the visual expression of a muscle or muscle group. That's an example of muscle changing shape. While I'll be pointing out the nominal shapes of the muscles, it's important to remember that the actual shape will be the result of the combination of multiple factors. 1, the state of the muscle, relaxed, contracted, or in between. The body type of the individual, and of course the point of view. Muscle attaches to bone via tendons. That's fibrous connective tissue. Anatomists make a distinction between 2 types of muscle-to-bone attachment, origin and insertion. Bones of origin tend to remain fixed. The bones that get the insertion are the ones that tend to move when the muscle is contracted. So let's start at the neck. We've already noted the large diamond-shaped muscle of the back, the trapezius, traps in gym parlance. Leonardo makes a study of the muscle here. Its sites of origin are all along the center of the muscle in the body. The top of the diamond attaches to the base of the skull and continues down along the 12 vertebrae of the rib cage. It inserts extending out at a diagonal, right and left, into the spines of the scapulae and the far ends of the clavicles. This muscle moves both the scapulae and the neck. It really helps in understanding the muscles to feel them at work in your own body. You can learn a lot by working out. If you become acquainted with the standard exercises for different muscle groups, you begin to develop an experiential sense of how each muscle moves. One of the standard exercises for the traps is the shrug. You hold a heavy weight, dumbbells or a barbell, and pull the muscles up to your ear and hold. Try it with me. If you have some weights around the house, that's great. You'll feel the muscles more readily. But even if you don't, try it anyway. Isolate the muscle, pull up in a shrug. You can feel it lift the scapulae. The other main visible muscle of the neck is the sternomastoid, also called the sternocleidomastoid. There's one on either side of the neck. It's often seen on the surface. It inserts along the bottom rear of the cranium, behind the jaw. and travels at a diagonal to find its origin on the manubrium of the sternum and along the first third or so of the clavicles. The negative shape between the two sternomastoids creates the V shape we often see in the neck right above the sternum. This muscle allows the head to swivel right and left, move side to side, as well as up and down. Let's take a look at the shoulders. There are two main muscles responsible for the form we see here. The first are the trapezius or traps, which we've already covered. The other, the deltoids or delts. Seen in the anterior or posterior view, I think of it as being like a half-circle shape, or in volume like a skull cap that's been rotated a couple degrees, though it's generally thought of as triangular in shape. The word deltoid comes to us from the Greek. Delta is the D letter in the Greek alphabet, which is triangular in shape. Each deltoid originates along the outer half of the clavicle and along the top spine of the scapula. It inserts onto the side of the humerus. Leonardo studied this muscle from the front, side, and rear. It's involved in several of the arm's movements, principal among them rotation. If I lift my arm straight up, that's the deltoid at work. And as the top of the muscle contracts, it lifts my arm up from my side. A common deltoid exercise is the straight arm raise. You extend your arm and raise it along an arc. Do it a couple of times, you'll begin to feel the muscle. On to the chest, the pectoralis major, the pecs. In the anterior view, this muscle's like a kid's drawing of a house shaped flipped 90 degrees. The point of the house inserts into the humerus underneath the deltoid, as Leonardo illustrates here. The house's base accounts for its origin along the sternum and the cartilage of the first 6 or 7 ribs. It also has origin sites along the first half of the clavicle. It's the muscle you work when you do a push-up or a bench press, or if you're a rock climber, pulling yourself up a cliff. Moving around to the side of the rib cage, we find the serratus. No monosyllabic name here, but it sounds like serrated. It comes from the same Latin root meaning saw, and I think you can see why. These muscles have their origins along the sides of the first 8 or 9 ribs and collect and insert under the scapula on each side. Their major function is to move the scapula. They're not particularly visible on most people's bodies, though you'll see them on bodybuilders. Next, the rectus abdominis, or abs. This has its origin along the pubic bone of the pelvis and inserts onto the costal cartilage of the 5th, 6th, and 7th ribs and goes on to the xiphoid process, or bottom point of the sternum. The top 3 sections of the muscle above the navel account for the six-pack. If you think about common ab exercises, well, they describe the main movement of this muscle. Sit-ups involve muscle contraction and an accompanying flexion of the spine. On either side of the abs and below the serratus, we get the external obliques. They curve around to the side of the abdomen. This muscle attaches above to ribs 5 through 12 and below to the pelvis. This, like the abs, is involved when you bend your spine. It also comes into play when you flex to the right or the left. So you're using this muscle when you do twist crunches. Like the serratus, these are generally only visible on people who've worked out a lot and have little body fat. The external obliques appear higher toward the back and slant lower toward the front, like the ribs. Jacopo Pontormo depicts both the serratus and external obliques in this standing figure. Let's move around to the back. We've already talked about the trapezius and deltoids, which we'll also see from the back. The other really large muscle of the back is the latissimus dorsi, or lats. It's triangular in shape, has its origin along the protruding spines of the bottom 6 thoracic vertebrae. That's the bottom 6 vertebrae of the rib cage, as well as the next 5 lumbar vertebrae. It has further origins along the spine of the sacrum and along the iliac crest of the pelvis. It has its insertion on the inside of the humerus near the top. It extends to cover the triangular points of the scapulae. This serves to hold them against the rib cage. It really defines the shape of the posterior view of the back. Standard lat exercises are wide grip chin-ups and wide grip lat pull-downs. In both, you'll hold your arms up over your head widely apart. If you just hold your arms up in this position, you can begin to feel the muscle. Not surprisingly, it's used for pulling and climbing. Rowing machines also work the lats. Zooming out a bit, you'll see that the lats get overlapped by the trapezius. If someone's well-muscled and doesn't have much body fat, we may see some of the external obliques on either side of the lats. Here, Leonardo's studying the latissimus dorsi in a lateral view. You'll also note the deltoid, serratus, and external oblique. You'll notice a group of muscles sandwiched in between the traps and the delts above and the lats below. We don't have time to give them more than a mention. What we're seeing here is a bit of the rhomboid. And then three muscles that cover the back of the scapula: the intraspinatus, the teres minor, and the teres major. And since we're digging down into layers of muscle, there's one more back muscle we should mention. That's the erector spinae. It's a fairly deep muscle, and as the name implies, it's responsible for holding the spine up straight. It's also referred to as a sacrospinalis. It goes all the way from the neck down to the sacrum in two vertical columns. You can often see evidence of the two columns on either side of the spine above the sacrum. It's what you're seeing here in the lower back, both in Leonardo's study and in the photo. That's our lightning tour of the trunk of the body. As we get into the limbs, the muscles multiply. Let's start with the thigh. In the anterior view, you'll notice that most of the muscles are like vertical strips, and most attach at the pelvis or near the top of the femur, and many extend to the area around the knee. The muscle that flamboyantly crosses over from the outside of the hip to the inside of the knee is the sartorius. It's the longest muscle in the body. The name comes from the Latin sartor, meaning tailor. Some suggest this muscle got its name because ancient tailors sat in a cross-legged position and the muscle was prominently visible as they did their work. Not sure I buy that. You have to be in pretty athletic shape for the muscle to be visible. Next, we have the quadriceps or quads. As the name implies, there are four of these, though we only see three on the surface. If I lift my leg from the hip, I'm using my quads. The center quad is the rectus femoris. On the outside of the thigh, we get the vastus lateralis. On the inside, the vastus medialis. The fourth quad is the vastus intermedius. As its name implies, it's in the middle, hidden underneath the rectus femoris, and sandwiched between the lateralis and the medialis. The next group are the adductors. Adduction is to move away or toward the center of the body. When I lift my leg out to the side like this, I'm using my adductors. There are 5 muscles in this group. They all have their origins on the pelvis. The first 4 have their insertions along the femur. The final one, on the inside of the thigh, inserts into the tibia. The first is the pectineus. Next, the adductor brevis. Then the adductor longus, followed by the adductor magnus, and finally the gracilis. You can clearly see the sartorius and elements of the quads and adductors here. Moving around to the back, we get the glutes. When you move your thigh backward or climb a set of stairs, you're using your glutes. We have the large gluteus maximus, which overlaps the smaller gluteus medius. The larger muscle has its origins along the iliac crest of the pelvis and on the side edges of the sacrum and coccyx. The insertion is on the femur below the great trochanter. The smaller glute also has its origin on the pelvis, but below the crest on the ilium, and has its insertion on the great trochanter. Let's take a look from the side because there are a couple other pieces that connect here. The big glute connects with a smaller muscle, the tensor fasciae lata, and both in turn connect with the long iliotibial tract, which functions as a tendon of the glute and terminates at the tibia. Leonardo is noting much of what we've just studied in this drawing. In the leg on the left, he includes the sartorius, the quads, and the adductors. In the leg on the right, he shows the glutes and the tensor fasciae lata. That's all we can cover in this lecture. We'll pick up in the next lecture with a conclusion of our discussion of human anatomy.